The day my mother removed my name from my grandfather's will, she smiled. Not because she was happy, because she thought she'd finally proven something. She looked me in the eyes and said, "Some people are born to inherit a legacy. Others only know how to walk away from it." My younger sister received the family farm. I received nothing, not even my grandfather's old pocket watch. So I stood up, wished everyone a good afternoon, and left without arguing. 3 years later, the same family farm stood only days away from foreclosure. My mother expected me to enjoy watching it fall apart. Instead, I saved it, quietly, without telling anyone. But when the truth finally reached my family, no amount of money could repair what had already been broken. Welcome back to Betrayal Stories. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. My name is Claire Morgan, and for most of my life, I believed families always protected one another. I was wrong. Sometimes, the deepest wounds don't come from strangers. They come from people who know exactly where your heart is, because they helped shape it. I grew up on a small family farm just outside a quiet town where everybody knew everyone else's business. Our farm wasn't famous. It wasn't luxurious, but it had been in our family for almost 90 years. My great-grandfather bought the first 40 acres after returning from the war. Every generation added something. A barn, a pond, another field, a bigger house. Every fence carried a story. Every tree had someone's initials carved into it. To me, it wasn't land. It was home. My grandfather, Walter Morgan, understood that better than anyone. When I was little, he never cared whether I came home covered in mud. He only laughed. "That means you were working." He taught me how to repair broken fences before I learned algebra. He showed me how to tell if rain was coming just by watching the clouds. Most importantly, he taught me something I never forgot. The land doesn't belong to us, Claire. We only borrow it. Our job is to leave it better than we found it. My younger sister, Hannah, wasn't interested in farming. She loved city life, fashion, coffee shops, weekend trips. She hated waking up early. She hated dirt. She complained every time Grandpa asked her to help outside. Nobody blamed her. Everyone has different dreams. The strange part wasn't that Hannah disliked farming. The strange part was that my mother always believed Hannah should inherit everything anyway. Whenever Grandpa praised me, Mom found a reason to interrupt. "Claire works too much. She'll never have a normal life. She needs a real career." If Hannah forgot to feed the chickens, Mom called it an honest mistake. If I forgot one tool in the barn, I heard about it for a week. At first I thought I imagined the difference. Then I got older and realized I hadn't imagined anything. Dad rarely argued, not because he agreed, because he avoided conflict. Whenever Mom made another unfair comment, he looked down at his coffee. That silence hurt almost as much as her words. When I turned 18, I left for college, not because I wanted to leave, because Grandpa insisted. "You can always come home, but nobody can take your education." So I studied environmental engineering. After graduation, I specialized in farmland conservation. Most people had never heard of the field. That was okay. I loved it. My job was helping struggling farms stay in family hands instead of being sold to developers. Ironically, I spent my career saving other people's farms, never imagining I'd one day fight for my own. Grandpa called every Sunday. Sometimes we'd talk about work, sometimes about weather. Sometimes we'd sit on the phone listening to each other breathe. Neither of us minded. Then one November morning, everything changed. Dad called. His voice sounded older. "Claire, Grandpa passed away last night." For a long time, neither of us said anything. The funeral brought together relatives I hadn't seen in years. Everyone hugged. Everyone cried. Everyone shared stories. But beneath the sadness, something else lingered. Expectation. Because everyone knew Grandpa had left a will. 1 week later, our family gathered at a lawyer's office. The room felt cold despite the fireplace burning quietly in the corner. Mom wore black. Hannah held Dad's hand. I sat quietly near the window. The attorney opened a thick folder. He smiled politely. "We'll begin." Grandpa left small gifts to cousins, donations to local charities, money to longtime employees. Then he reached the farm. The room became completely silent. The Morgan farm? He adjusted his glasses. Will pass in full ownership to Hannah Morgan. Mom smiled immediately. Hannah looked shocked. I remained perfectly still. The lawyer continued. Claire Morgan.
He paused.
Your grandfather left you a personal letter. Only a letter. Nothing else. Mom slowly looked toward me. Well, I suppose Grandpa knew what he was doing. I accepted the envelope without opening it. It was old, handwritten. My name covered the front in Grandpa's familiar handwriting. The lawyer asked whether anyone had questions. Mom answered before anyone else could.
No.
We're satisfied. Satisfied. That word echoed inside my head all afternoon. Outside, Hannah hurried after me. Claire, I'm so sorry. I smiled. It's okay.
No.
It isn't. She held back tears. I never asked for this. I know. You can hate me if you want. I hugged her. I don't. And I meant it. None of this was Hannah's fault. That evening, I finally opened Grandpa's letter. Inside, there was no explanation for the will.
No apology. No complaint.
Instead, he wrote about the land, about the old creek running behind the north pasture, about the wetlands few people even noticed, about how developers had offered him millions over the years. Then came the final paragraph. Claire, if you're reading this, life probably feels unfair. Maybe it is. But remember something, anyone can inherit land. Very few people know how to protect it. One day, the farm may need someone who understands that difference. If that day ever comes, you'll know exactly what to do. I've always trusted you. Love, Grandpa. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into its envelope. At the time, I thought it was simply Grandpa trying to comfort me. I had no idea those few handwritten pages contained a secret that would one day decide the future of our family's farm. And when that day arrived, everyone who believed I had been left with nothing would discover that my grandfather had actually left me the most valuable inheritance of all. For the next few weeks, life moved forward. Or at least, it looked like it did. I returned to Burlington and buried myself in work. Every day, I helped families protect farmland from developers. I negotiated conservation agreements, reviewed property maps, spent hours walking fields with farmers who were terrified of losing land their grandparents had worked their entire lives to build. It was rewarding work, but every evening, when I got home, I found myself opening Grandpa's letter again, reading the same lines. The farm may need someone who understands the difference. I couldn't understand what he meant. The farm belonged to Hannah now. There was nothing left for me to do, or so I thought. About 2 months after the funeral, Hannah called. It wasn't unusual. We had always stayed close, even when the rest of the family made things difficult. Hey. Her voice sounded tired. Busy. I can always make time for you. She laughed softly. I just wanted to hear a friendly voice. Everything okay? There was a long pause. Mom's already making plans. What kind of plans? She wants to renovate the farmhouse. I smiled. That sounds nice.
No.
It doesn't. Hannah sighed. She wants to tear down Grandpa's workshop. My smile disappeared. The old workshop? Yes. I immediately pictured the little wooden building behind the barn. The place where Grandpa repaired tractors, sharpened tools, taught me how to build birdhouses. Every scratch on those walls held a memory. Why? I asked quietly. She says it's outdated and wants a bigger guest house. I closed my eyes. Grandpa had loved that workshop more than any room on the property. What did Dad say? You know, Dad. He said, whatever your mother thinks is best. Neither of us spoke. That answer sounded exactly like him. Will you come home this weekend? Hannah asked. I think. I just need someone on my side. Without hesitation, I'll be there. Saturday morning, I drove the familiar country roads back toward Morgan Farm. Nothing had changed. The same old windmill stood near the entrance. The same white fences stretched across the hills. Even the mailbox still leaned slightly to one side. It felt like coming home. And somehow, like visiting a place where I no longer belonged. Mom greeted me at the front door. She looked surprised. "I didn't know you were coming." Hannah invited me. She stepped aside. "Well."
Come in.
There wasn't much warmth in her voice. There never had been. Lunch was quiet. Dad talked about the weather. Mom discussed furniture catalogs. Hannah barely touched her food. Finally, Mom smiled. "I've already spoken to an architect." I looked up. For what? The new guest house. She spread several blueprints across the table. "The workshop comes down first." I stared at the drawings. The new building would sit exactly where Grandpa's workshop stood.
No.
The words slipped out before I could stop it. Everyone looked at me. Mom slowly folded her hands. "I'm sorry." Grandpa loved that workshop. So, it doesn't need to be destroyed." She smiled politely. "It isn't your decision." The words landed harder than she probably intended, because she was right. Legally, it wasn't. I turned toward Hannah. "What do you want?" She looked down. I don't know." Mom answered for her. "Hannah agrees with me." Hannah remained silent. I knew that silence. It wasn't agreement. It was surrender. After lunch, I walked outside alone. The crisp autumn air carried the familiar smell of fresh hay. My feet followed the same path they had taken thousands of times growing up, toward Grandpa's workshop. The little building looked exactly the same. Old wooden walls, faded green paint, rusty hinges that squeaked every time the door opened.
Inside.
Everything remained untouched. His tools still hung neatly on the wall. His old radio sat beside the workbench. Even his reading glasses rested exactly where he'd left them. For a moment, it felt like he might walk through the door at any second. I ran my hand across the workbench. Dust covered my fingers. Then something caught my eye. A small metal box tucked beneath the bottom shelf. I frowned. I had never seen it before. The lock wasn't locked. I opened it carefully. Inside were old property maps, soil surveys, handwritten notes, several yellowed photographs, and another envelope. This one simply read, "For Claire." My heartbeat quickened. Inside was another letter. "If you found this, then they're probably changing things faster than they should. The maps in this box matter more than anyone realizes. Don't throw them away. One day they'll explain everything." I unfolded the first map. It showed the farm exactly as it looked today, but strange blue markings crossed several fields.
Creeks. Wetlands.
Protected areas. Every note was written in Grandpa's handwriting. Then I noticed one sentence circled in red ink. "Protected watershed cannot legally be developed without federal approval." I blinked.
Protected?
Nobody had ever mentioned protected land. Not once. I carefully rolled the maps back together. Just then, a voice startled me. "What are you doing?" I turned around. Mom stood in the doorway. Her eyes immediately fell on the maps. "Oh, those old papers." She waved her hand dismissively. "They're junk." I was planning to throw them away. I instinctively held the box closer. "I'll take them." She shrugged. "If you want. They're useless." I smiled politely. I don't think Grandpa kept useless things. For just a second, something crossed her face. Almost annoyance. Almost guilt. Then it disappeared. "Suit yourself." She walked away. I looked back at the box. Something told me Grandpa hadn't hidden these papers by accident. And for the first time since reading his first letter, I began to wonder if he'd known something the rest of US didn't. Something that could one day decide whether Morgan Farm survived or disappeared forever. I didn't tell anyone about the metal box. Not Hannah, not my parents, not even my closest friend. Something about Grandpa's handwriting made me feel as though he wanted me to discover those papers quietly, without anyone else knowing. So I loaded the maps, letters, and old documents into my car before leaving the farm that evening. As I drove back to Burlington, one question kept repeating inside my mind. What was Grandpa trying to protect? Monday morning, instead of going straight to work, I spread every document across my dining room table. There were dozens of old maps, handwritten notes, survey reports dating back almost 40 years, environmental studies, tax records. Some pages were so old they were beginning to fade. For nearly 4 hours, I read every single one. Then I found something unusual. A folded government document from 1994. Across the top, State Conservation Partnership Agreement. I frowned. I'd worked in farmland conservation for 6 years. I knew exactly what that document meant. And one thing immediately stood out. It had never been finalized. According to Grandpa's notes, a protected conservation easement had been discussed years earlier. But something interrupted the process. There were several unfinished signatures, missing paperwork, and one sentence circled 3 different times. Complete only if the family faces financial hardship. I leaned back in my chair. Grandpa hadn't abandoned the idea. He had postponed it, almost as though he expected someone to need it later. My phone buzzed. It was Hannah. Hey, you busy? Never too busy for you. She sounded nervous. Mom doesn't know I'm calling. What happened? There was a long pause. We're having money problems.
Ich said uprights.
What kind of problems? The crop prices dropped again. And Dad refinanced the equipment loan. My stomach tightened. Without telling you? Mom handled everything. How bad is it? Another silence. I don't really know. But people from the bank have been visiting. After we hung up, something didn't feel right. My parents had always been careful with money. If banks were showing up in person, the situation was probably much worse than Hannah realized. That afternoon, I drove to the county records office. The clerk recognized me immediately. Claire, back looking at farmland records again? I smiled. As always. She laughed. You conservation people never stop. I handed her Grandpa's property identification number. Could I see the latest public filings? She disappeared into the archive room. A few minutes later, she returned carrying a thick folder. Here you go. The first few pages looked normal. Property taxes, boundary updates, water usage permits. Then, halfway through the folder, I found it. A recorded lien. Then another. And another. My heartbeat slowed. 3 loans. 2 mortgages. 1 emergency operating loan. Altogether, the farm owed nearly $2.8 million. I stared at the numbers in disbelief. Grandpa had left the farm debt-free. How had things become this bad in only 3 years? The clerk noticed my expression. Everything all right? I forced a smile. Just surprised. She lowered her voice. A lot of farms are struggling, but she hesitated. That property worries me. Why? She looked around before answering. There's already discussion about foreclosure if the next payments are missed. Foreclosure. The word echoed in my head. Grandpa had spent his entire life protecting that land. Now, it was only months away from being auctioned. That evening, I drove past the farm without stopping. From the road, everything looked normal. The fields were green. The fences still stood. The porch light glowed warmly. Anyone driving by would think nothing had changed. But I knew the truth. Sometimes, the strongest-looking houses are carrying the heaviest burdens. A week later, I received another call from Hannah. This time, she was crying. Claire, they're selling Grandpa's tractors. I closed my eyes. What? The bank demanded another payment. So Dad sold 2 tractors. And Mom says we'll probably have to sell part of the south field next.
No.
The word escaped before I realized I'd spoken. What? They can't sell that field. Why? I'll explain later. Because according to Grandpa's maps, that field contained protected wetlands. Selling it separately could trigger years of legal complications. Maybe even invalidate future conservation protections. Exactly what Grandpa had warned about. That weekend, I returned home. This time, the atmosphere felt completely different. Nobody talked about renovations anymore. Nobody mentioned the guest house. Instead, stacks of unpaid bills covered the kitchen table. Dad looked exhausted. His shoulders seemed smaller than I remembered. Even Mom, usually so confident, looked worried. Dinner was painfully quiet. Finally, Dad spoke. We've had a rough season. Mom immediately interrupted. We're handling it.
Dad looked down again.
The conversation ended there. After dinner, I found Dad alone inside the old barn. He was repairing a broken gate. Or pretending to. Mostly, he just stared at the wood. You okay? He smiled weakly. I've been better. I leaned against the doorway. Hannah told me about the loans. His hands stopped moving. She shouldn't worry you. I'm already worried. For nearly a minute, neither of us spoke. Finally, he whispered, I failed your grandfather. I looked toward him.
No,
I did.
he sighed.
I signed papers I barely understood. I trusted the wrong people. I kept believing next season would fix everything.
His voice cracked.
It never did. I had never seen my father cry.
Until that night.
I can help, I said quietly. He shook his head immediately.
No.
Why? Because your mother.
He stopped.
I already knew the answer. Mom would never accept help from the daughter she'd spent years telling everyone had walked away from the family. Her pride mattered more than appearances. Sometimes, even more than the farm itself. Before leaving, I walked one last time to Grandpa's workshop. Everything remained untouched. I unfolded the conservation maps again. This time, I noticed something I had missed before. A small note written in the corner. Contact Samuel Pierce if anything ever happens. I frowned. Samuel Pierce. The name sounded familiar. Then it hit me. Samuel Pierce had been Grandpa's lawyer. The same attorney who retired years ago. Monday morning, I tracked him down. He was 81 now, living quietly near Lake Champlain. When I introduced myself, his face immediately softened. Walter's granddaughter. He smiled warmly. I've been wondering when you'd come. I blinked. You knew I'd come? He nodded. He told me, one day Claire will have questions. My heartbeat quickened. There are things your grandfather couldn't explain while he was alive. He stood slowly. Come inside. I think it's finally time you heard the whole story. As I followed him into his study, I had no idea. The conversation I was about to have would completely change everything I believed about Grandpa's will. Because the farm hadn't been left to Hannah by accident. There had been another reason. One Grandpa had carried to his grave. And once I learned it, I understood why he had trusted only one person to protect Morgan Farm. Me. Samuel Pierce's house overlooked a quiet lake. It wasn't fancy. A small white cottage with blue shutters, an old porch swing, and flower beds that had clearly been cared for by the same hands for many years. When I stepped inside, I immediately noticed framed photographs covering one wall. Some showed Samuel as a young attorney. Others showed local farmers. And right in the center, there was Grandpa. Both men stood beside the old red barn, laughing about something neither of them would ever remember. Samuel noticed me looking. That was taken 31 years ago. He was a stubborn man. I smiled. I've heard that. Samuel laughed. You inherited that part. He led me into his study. Books filled every shelf. Old property maps covered one wall. Everything smelled faintly of cedar and old paper. He opened a locked cabinet, carefully removed a thick leather folder, then placed it on the desk between us. I've been holding on to this for almost 6 years. My eyes widened. For me? He nodded. Walter asked me to. I slowly opened the folder. Inside were letters, legal documents, hand-drawn maps, and one sealed envelope with my name written across the front. Samuel pointed toward it. He told me not to give that to anyone else. Not even your parents. My hands trembled slightly as I opened the envelope. Grandpa's familiar handwriting filled the page. Claire, if you're reading this, then the farm is probably in trouble. That isn't because I expected anyone to fail. It's because farming has become harder every year. The weather changes. Markets change. Banks change. But people rarely change. I swallowed hard. The letter continued. You probably spent years wondering why I left the farm to Hannah instead of you. You deserve the truth. I leaned closer. Your mother believed that keeping the peace meant giving everyone what they wanted. She wanted Hannah to own the farm. She believed you would leave anyway because you were smart enough to build your own life. We argued about it for months. I stopped breathing for a moment. They had argued. Grandpa hadn't simply accepted it. Samuel quietly spoke. Your grandfather never wanted you to feel rejected. I looked at him. So, why didn't he change the will? Samuel sighed. Because Walter wasn't trying to protect the farm from strangers. He was trying to protect it from division inside the family. I frowned. I don't understand. Samuel opened another document. Your grandfather knew that if he left the farm to you, your mother would contest the will. And if she lost, the family would never recover. He handed me another paper. It was an old handwritten note. Walter's signature appeared at the bottom. Sometimes the only way to save something is to let people believe they've won. I stared at those words. Grandpa had planned everything. Samuel leaned back. He believed Hannah would eventually need help. And he believed only one person would help without asking for anything in return. You. I felt tears filling my eyes. He trusted me that much? Samuel smiled. He trusted you more than anyone. For several minutes. Neither of us spoke. Finally, I asked, the conservation papers, were they connected? Samuel nodded immediately. Very much. He unfolded one of the large property maps. This land isn't ordinary farmland. He pointed toward the northern fields. These wetlands supply water to nearly 4 surrounding communities. He moved his finger farther east. The weather changes. Markets change. Banks change. But people rarely change. I swallowed hard. The letter continued. You probably spent years wondering why I left the farm to Hannah instead of you. You deserve the truth. I leaned closer. Your mother believed that keeping the peace meant giving everyone what they wanted. She wanted Hannah to own the farm. She believed you would leave anyway because you were smart enough to build your own life. We argued about it for months. I stopped breathing for a moment. They had argued. Grandpa hadn't simply accepted it. Samuel quietly spoke. Your grandfather never wanted you to feel rejected. I looked at him. So, why didn't he change the will? Samuel sighed. Because Walter wasn't trying to protect the farm from strangers. He was trying to protect it from division inside the family. I frowned. I don't understand. Samuel opened another document. Your grandfather knew that if he left the farm to you, your mother would contest the will. And if she lost, the family would never recover. He handed me another paper. It was an old handwritten note. Walter's signature appeared at the bottom. Sometimes the only way to save something is to let people believe they've won. I stared at those words. Grandpa had planned everything. Samuel leaned back. He believed Hannah would eventually need help. And he believed only one person would help without asking for anything in return. You. I felt tears filling my eyes. He trusted me that much? Samuel smiled. He trusted you more than anyone. For several minutes. Neither of us spoke. Finally, I asked, the conservation papers, were they connected? Samuel nodded immediately. Very much. He unfolded one of the large property maps. This land isn't ordinary farmland. He pointed toward the northern fields. These wetlands supply water to nearly 4 surrounding communities. He moved his finger farther east. And this forest contains one of the oldest protected oak habitats in the county. I looked closer. I'd never realized how environmentally significant Grandpa's property really was. Samuel continued. If properly protected, the conservation value alone could eliminate most of the farm's financial pressure. My eyes widened. How much? He quietly answered.
Million.
I stared at him. Then why didn't Grandpa complete the agreement himself? He almost did. Samuel replied. But conservation easements require every property owner to fully understand what they're giving up. He wanted the next generation to choose it willingly. Not because he forced them. I slowly nodded. That sounded exactly like Grandpa. He never believed in forcing people. He believed in teaching them. But Hannah doesn't know any of this. Samuel looked thoughtful.
No.
Neither does your mother. And judging from the loan records, they've unknowingly made several decisions that could permanently damage the farm. My stomach tightened. What kind of decisions? They've begun separating parcels. They've discussed selling protected sections. If they continue, the conservation opportunity disappears forever. For the first time, panic settled into my chest. How long do we have? Samuel didn't answer immediately. Finally, he said, "Not long." He reached for another folder. This arrived yesterday. It was a foreclosure timeline, according to the bank. If the next major payment wasn't made within 90 days, formal foreclosure proceedings would begin. 90 days. That was all. Driving home, I couldn't stop thinking about Grandpa's words. Sometimes the only way to save something is to let people believe they've won. Had he known this moment would come? Had he known I'd eventually face a choice between protecting my pride or protecting the farm? That night, I barely slept. Instead, I ran numbers, property values, conservation grants, tax credits, federal agriculture programs. By sunrise, one thing became painfully clear. The farm could still be saved, but only if someone acted immediately. The problem wasn't money. The problem was my mother. She would never accept help from me, especially after years of insisting I wasn't part of the future of Morgan Farm. 3 days later, I received another phone call from Hannah. This time, she sounded terrified. "Claire, the bank was here." I stood immediately. "What happened?" "They gave Mom and Dad another notice. They're talking about an auction." "When?" "In less than 3 months." I looked out my office window. Cars moved below. People hurried through their ordinary lives, completely unaware that my family's entire history was quietly slipping away. That evening, I drove to Morgan Farm again. The sunset painted the fields gold, exactly the way Grandpa loved them. I parked beside the old workshop, walked through the grass, and stood beside the fence he'd built with his own hands. For the first time since his funeral, I spoke out loud. "I know what you were trying to do." The wind moved softly through the trees. "I just don't know if I'm strong enough." Silence answered, but somehow, it didn't feel empty. The next morning, I walked into my office and called my legal team. "I need everyone in the conference room." Within 30 minutes, 5 attorneys and 2 conservation specialists sat around the table. They looked at me curiously. I placed Grandpa's maps in the center. "I have 90 days. One lawyer frowned. "For what?" I looked around the room. "To save a family farm, whose owners don't even know I'm trying to save it." The room fell silent. Then my lead attorney smiled.
Sounds impossible.
I smiled back. "So, did everything else Grandpa ever accomplished?" I stood. "Let's get to work." Unknown to my family, the rescue had officially begun. But there was one person watching every move I made. A local real estate developer who had spent years trying to buy Morgan Farm. He had already offered millions. Grandpa had always refused. Now, he believed the foreclosure was finally his chance. And he had no intention of letting me stop him. Monday morning began with a single decision. I wasn't going to wait for another phone call. I wasn't going to wait for another foreclosure notice. And I definitely wasn't going to stand by while 90 years of family history disappeared because of pride. If my family refused my help, I'd help them anyway, even if they never found out. Inside my office, my legal team gathered around the conference table. Maps covered every inch of the surface. Loan records, property surveys, environmental reports, government conservation guidelines. Every document told the same story. Morgan Farm wasn't failing because it lacked value. It was failing because nobody understood what it was truly worth. Emily, my senior attorney, adjusted her glasses. The conservation easement could reduce their debt dramatically. "How long?" I asked. "If everything goes perfectly."
She paused.
"About 60 days." I frowned. "We only have 90. She nodded. "And that's assuming no one interferes." Jacob, our environmental specialist, pointed toward the northern fields. "These wetlands are extraordinary." He shook his head. "Developers would pay millions to build here. But legally, they shouldn't be allowed." I looked at Grandpa's old map. He had known, decades before anyone else. Then another concern appeared. Emily slid a folder toward me. "There's someone buying land around her family's property." I opened the report. Every purchase surrounded Morgan Farm like pieces of a puzzle. One company name appeared again and again. Blackridge Development Group. The owner, Victor Lawson. I recognized the name immediately. Victor Lawson wasn't just another developer. He was famous for buying struggling family farms, promising jobs, promising growth, promising opportunity, then replacing fields with shopping centers and luxury homes. By the time people realized what had happened, their communities had already changed forever. Jacob looked at me. He made another offer last week. To my family? Jacob nodded. They refuse. For now. That afternoon, I drove to the county planning office. A longtime employee named Carol greeted me warmly. Claire, what brings you here? I need every public filing connected to Blackridge Development. Carol raised an eyebrow. That's a lot of paperwork. I'll wait. 3 hours later, boxes surrounded my desk. Permit applications, survey requests, environmental assessments, rezoning proposals. One by one, I read them. Then something caught my attention. A proposed highway expansion. The future highway would run less than a mile from Morgan Farm. Suddenly, everything made sense. Victor didn't want farmland. He wanted commercial property. Once the highway opened, the land's value would explode. I whispered to myself, so that's your plan. The following morning, my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered. Claire Morgan. Speaking. This is Victor Lawson. His voice sounded smooth, confident, the kind of voice that had convinced countless families to sell everything. I've heard impressive things about you. I'm sure you have. I understand your family owns Morgan Farm. My sister does. He chuckled. Details. I was hoping we could meet. What about? I think we can help each other. Against my better judgment, I agreed. Not because I trusted him, because I wanted to understand what he already knew. We met at a country club overlooking the valley. Victor arrived wearing an expensive suit and an even more expensive smile. After a few minutes of polite conversation, he leaned forward. I'll be honest, I've wanted Morgan Farm for years. I know. He smiled. Then you also know your family can't keep it. I remained silent. He slid a folder across the table. Inside was a purchase offer. The amount was staggering. Far more than the farm's market value. Why so much? I asked. Victor smiled. Location. Nothing more. Nothing less. I closed the folder. My family isn't selling. His smile never disappeared. They will. Eventually, before leaving, he said something that stayed with me. Every family has one person who finally realizes holding on is impossible. I wonder who yours will be. Driving away, I couldn't stop thinking about those words. Victor wasn't waiting for foreclosure. He was counting on it. That evening, Hannah called again. Her voice trembled. Claire, Mom sold Grandpa's antique tractor. I closed my eyes. The red one? Yes. The one he restored with you. I couldn't speak. That tractor wasn't just equipment. It was history. She said we needed the money. Hannah whispered. But it barely covered one loan payment. The next Saturday, I returned home. This time, the barn looked emptier. The old tractor was gone. Several pieces of equipment had disappeared too. The farm looked like it was slowly being erased. Dad found me standing inside the barn. I hated selling it, he said quietly. I know. He stared at the empty space. Your grandfather would have been heartbroken. I placed a hand on his shoulder. He'd be worried, but he wouldn't give up. Dad looked at me carefully. You've been working on something. I froze. What makes you think that? I know your face. You only get that determined look when you've already made a decision. I smiled slightly. Maybe,
He sighed.
if you know a way to save this place. I hope you try. What about Mom? His tired eyes met mine. Leave your mother to me. For the first time in years, my father had chosen a side. The following week, our legal team submitted the first conservation application. Federal agencies began reviewing the property. Environmental inspectors scheduled visits. Everything moved faster than expected. Then, the unexpected happened. Emily rushed into my office. You need to see this. She placed a letter on my desk. My heart sank. Blackridge Development had officially challenged the conservation request. According to their filing, Morgan Farm no longer qualified for protection. They claimed portions of the wetlands had been damaged, that certain wildlife habitats no longer existed, and, therefore, the land should remain eligible for commercial development. I looked at Emily. Can they do this? They can try. Jacob entered carrying photographs. You need to see these. The images showed bulldozer tracks, fresh tire marks, damaged fencing. Someone had entered protected land illegally. Not recently, weeks ago. A cold feeling settled over me. This wasn't an accident. Jacob nodded. They're trying to make the property appear environmentally damaged. I slowly stood. They're sabotaging Grandpa's plan. Emily nodded. And if the government believes those reports, the conservation agreement could fail. That night, I drove back to Morgan Farm alone. Moonlight stretched across the empty fields. Everything looked peaceful, but hidden beneath that silence, someone had declared war. Not with threats, not with violence, with paperwork, money, influence. Exactly the kind of battle Victor Lawson expected to win. I walked to Grandpa's workshop, unlocked the old door, sat quietly at his workbench, the same place where he once taught me to fix broken tools instead of replacing them. I smiled through tired eyes. You really knew this day would come. The workshop remained silent, yet somehow, it still felt like he was sitting beside me, waiting, trusting me, just as he always had. The next morning, I called every environmental expert I knew, every attorney, every conservation officer, every honest person willing to fight for the truth. If Victor Lawson wanted a legal battle, he was about to discover something Grandpa had taught me long ago. The strongest roots aren't always the ones you can see. Sometimes, they're buried deep beneath the surface, quietly holding everything together. And I wasn't about to let anyone tear them out. The county courthouse had never been so crowded. Farmers filled nearly every seat. Local business owners stood along the walls. Reporters adjusted their cameras. Environmental experts organized stacks of reports. Everyone had come to witness one hearing, not because it involved millions of dollars, because it involved Morgan Farm, a place almost everyone in the county had grown up knowing. I arrived 30 minutes early with my legal team. Emily carried 2 large boxes filled with evidence. Jacob rolled in maps almost 6 feet long. Samuel Pierce walked beside us, moving slowly but proudly. He looked at me and smiled. Walter would have loved today. I smiled back. I hope I make him proud. You already have. Across the hallway, Victor Lawson entered with 3 attorneys. Perfect suits, expensive briefcases, confident smiles. Victor nodded politely when he saw me. You still have time to walk away. I smiled. I've heard that before. You'll lose. We'll see. Inside the courtroom, the hearing began. Judge Eleanor Hayes adjusted her glasses and looked around the room. We're here to determine whether Morgan Farm qualifies for permanent conservation protection and whether Blackridge Development's objections have legal merit. She looked toward Victor. You may begin. Victor's lead attorney stood confidently. For decades, this property has been underused. He displayed photographs of damaged wetlands, broken fencing, mud tracks, dead vegetation. Our experts conclude the environmental value has already been compromised. He paused dramatically. Therefore, the proposed conservation easement serves no public purpose. Several people in the audience whispered. Everything sounded convincing. Exactly as Victor intended. The judge nodded. Ms. Morgan, your response. I stood slowly, walked toward the center of the courtroom, looked once at Grandpa's maps, then at everyone watching. My grandfather taught me something. The truth doesn't need the loudest voice. It only needs proof. Emily handed me the first exhibit. These photographs submitted by Blackridge were taken after illegal vehicles entered protected wetlands. Victor's attorney interrupted. Objection. Speculation. I smiled. Not speculation. Evidence. Jacob connected a laptop to the courtroom screen. Security camera footage appeared. The video showed two bulldozers entering Morgan Farm late at night. The company logo on both machines was clearly visible. Blackridge Development. The courtroom fell silent. Victor's smile disappeared. The video continued. Workers drove repeatedly across protected marshland, destroyed native plants, cut temporary access roads. Everything had been recorded. Every minute, every vehicle, every license plate. The judge looked toward Victor. Would you like to explain this? His attorneys whispered urgently. Victor remained silent. Emily spoke next. The environmental damage wasn't natural. It wasn't caused by the Morgan family. It was intentionally created to disqualify the property from conservation protection. She handed copies of maintenance logs to the judge. These machines belong to Blackridge Development. Then came the biggest surprise. Samuel slowly walked to the witness stand. After taking the oath, he reached inside his briefcase. I have something. He placed an old cassette tape on the table. The courtroom looked confused. Samuel smiled. Walter believed in keeping records. The tape had been professionally digitized. The judge allowed it to play. Grandpa's familiar voice filled the room. Though older, it was unmistakably his. If you're listening to this, I suspect someone is trying to buy my farm after I'm gone. Soft laughter echoed from the recording. I've turned down enough offers to know greed never gives up. Everyone listened in complete silence. I've documented every protected stream, every wetland, every habitat. If anyone damages this property to lower its conservation value, they're committing fraud. The recording ended. No one moved. Victor looked pale. His attorney leaned toward him. You never told us about this. Victor whispered, I didn't know. The judge reviewed the evidence for nearly an hour. Then, she returned. The court has reached a decision. The room became completely silent. First, the evidence clearly establishes that Blackridge Development illegally entered protected land. Second, the submitted environmental objections were based on damage caused by Blackridge itself. Third, Morgan Farm fully qualifies for permanent conservation protection. A wave of relief spread across the courtroom. But the judge wasn't finished. She looked directly at Victor Lawson. I am referring this matter to state investigators for potential fraud, trespassing, and environmental violations. Gasps filled the room. Victor lowered his head. For the first time, he had nothing to say. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded me. Microphones appeared from every direction. Ms. Morgan, did you expect this outcome? How long have you been working to save the farm? I smiled politely. This was never about winning. It was about protecting something my grandfather spent his entire life building. That evening, I drove home. The sunset stretched across the fields exactly as it had when I was a little girl. For the first time in months, I felt peace. A week later, the conservation agreement became official. Morgan Farm received federal protection. The debt was dramatically reduced through grants, tax credits, and conservation funding. The foreclosure was canceled. The family farm would remain exactly what Grandpa wanted it to be, a working farm, protected for future generations. The following Sunday, Mom called. Not Hannah, not Dad.
Mom.
Her voice sounded quieter than I had ever heard it. Claire, could you come over? I knew why. Of course. When I arrived, the entire family was waiting. Dad, Hannah,
Mom.
even Samuel had been invited. The kitchen table looked exactly as it had after Grandpa's funeral, except this time, nobody cared about inheritance. Mom stood first. She looked directly at me,
And
she began to cry. I spent years believing success meant choosing the child who needed me most. She wiped her eyes. I never realized I was pushing away the one who never stopped loving this family.
he walked over quietly.
She shook her head. I don't deserve your forgiveness.
No.
I answered gently. Maybe not today. But families don't heal in one afternoon. They heal one choice at a time. Dad hugged me tighter than he ever had before. I'm proud of you, he whispered. I should have said that years ago. I smiled. I'm just happier saying it now. Then Hannah stood. She reached into her purse, pulled out a folded document, and placed it in front of me. I've already signed. I looked down. It was a transfer of ownership. The farm. Back to me.
Ich ser det her.
I can't take this. She smiled. Yes, you can. You were always the one Grandpa trusted. I finally understand why. I looked around the room, then slowly pushed the document back toward her.
No.
Everyone looked surprised. Hannah, this farm doesn't belong to one person. It belongs to our family. I picked up a pen, then added a new clause. Morgan Family Agricultural Trust. The land could never again be sold without unanimous agreement. It would remain protected for future generations. No single person could lose it. No single argument could divide it. Samuel smiled through tears. Walter would have loved this. Months later, children ran through the same fields where I had once chased butterflies with Grandpa. The workshop remained exactly where it had always stood. Instead of tearing it down, we restored it.
Inside.
We created a small museum filled with Grandpa's tools, photographs, and handwritten journals. Every school in the county brought students to visit. They didn't come to see old tractors. They came to learn what it meant to protect something bigger than yourself. One afternoon, I sat alone on Grandpa's favorite bench, overlooking the north pasture. The wind moved gently through the tall grass. I unfolded his first letter one last time. Anyone can inherit land. Very few people know how to protect it. This time, I finally understood. He had never been preparing me to own the farm. He had been preparing me to save it. And those turned out to be two very different things. I folded the letter carefully, smiled toward the fields, and quietly whispered, I kept my promise, Grandpa. The breeze moved softly across the pasture, almost as if somewhere he was smiling too.